for Jordan, who injured his ankle but still showed up. So I don't know. There he is. Everyone, he still came injured. How great has this conference been? Thank you so much to the sponsors, Invader. You guys designed someone on your site designed the template that I'm one day going to actually build out into my personal website, so much love. And I met someone from North Dakota, which is that is the gold star of states in the US. You can't, those people don't exist. I had to come to Australia to meet someone from North Dakota. But now you have all also met them, so that's awesome. All right, so the good, bad bug, learning from failure. Boom, let's get started. This is me. This is me on Twitter. This is me on GitHub. This is me pretty much anywhere but YouTube. There, I'm comp chomp. All right, so when I was 26, I decided that I wanted to learn how to fly. Now, my friends and my family were very skeptical. They reminded me that I'm afraid of heights and that I get motion sick and that I don't know how to drive a car. And all of these things were very, very true, but I didn't see how they were relevant. I just wasn't gonna let anyone clip my wings. So we're 6 months in now, and I'm on final approach to runway 21 in Santa Monica after a routine training flight. And I eased back on the throttle, I tilted the plane's nose up slightly to flare, and I floated gracefully, more or less, to the ground. And suddenly, there was a sharp pull on the yoke, and the plane jerked to the side. My instructor was immediately on the controls. I have the plane, he said. I was like, oh, you've got the plane. And he brought us safely to a stop. And we ended up on the runway, and we radioed the tower to let them know we were having a problem. And we got out and we inspected the damage. It was a flat tire. Now, my heart started returning to normal, and the plane was safely stopped. No one was injured, so it was no big deal. All we had to do was get it towed back to the maintenance and change out the tire. The runway would have been blocked for less than 5 minutes. So I was actually really surprised when my instructor said, I'm gonna drop you back off at the classroom and then I'll go start filling out the FAA paperwork. My heart rate jumped right back up. Look, nobody got hurt and the plane isn't damaged at all, so why does there have to be any paperwork? You see, in addition to not being the biggest fan of paperwork, I was also worried that my instructor was going to get in trouble for my flat tire. But it turns out that the FAA collects data on every event, big or small, even a tiny little flat tire on a 4-seater airplane. They want to get as much data as possible so that they can start working out patterns that can help them implement safer systems. They know that the more data they get, they'll be able to draw better conclusions. But they also know that people don't like paperwork or getting yelled at. So to make sure that people are more likely to file their paperwork, they won't punish a pilot for a mistake as long as there were no injuries and nothing the pilot did was illegal, and you fill out the paperwork. So if you don't fill it out, you can get in trouble, but if you fill it out, you're fine. Now think about the very different approach that we have for road accidents. When I was 12 years old, I was riding home from the Saturn dealership in a shiny brand new car. This was the first new car my parents had ever bought. We were sitting at a stoplight when suddenly we lurched forward. We'd been rear-ended. My dad got out of the car and went and checked on the other driver, an incredibly nervous 16-year-old boy who had just rear-ended someone's brand new car. He was fine, everyone in our car was fine, and the only damage to the car was a puncture right on the bumper from the other kid's license plate. My dad looked it over and he said, well, you know what, that's what bumpers are for. He told the kid to be careful, and then we all got back in our slightly less shiny car, and we drove home. Now, there was never any paperwork filed. No data was ever gathered. There's not a single group that actually collects data on road accidents, at least in the United States, but I haven't found mention of one in any country. It's usually handled by local agencies like the police. And local agencies actually get kind of annoyed at you if you call them up to tell them something about something like a flat tire. They kind of get annoyed if you call them up to tell them about being rear-ended. They're just like, cool, was anyone hurt? No, then stop wasting our time. So the accident will never get recorded. Now, these approaches have actually led to very different outcomes. I looked up the most recent stats, which were available for the year 2015, and for every 1 billion miles people in the US travel by car, 3.1 people die. And for every 1 billion miles people in the US travel by plane, there are only 0.5 deaths. Now, I know that decimals, especially when you're talking about fractions of people, can be a bit complicated to hold in your head. So there, that's a bit easier. If you hold the miles traveled steady, 64 people died traveling in a car for every 1 person that dies traveling in a plane. Now, you might be thinking, well, everyone knows Americans drive really, really terribly, so, you know, what does this mean to us? And we are definitely, we're not the worst, but we're definitely some of the worst. So I took a look, and we're about 32% worse than Australia when it comes to road deaths. So that means you're closer to 42 deaths per billion miles traveled versus 1 per air mile traveled, which is still pretty crazy. I mean, there's something really interesting hiding in those numbers. We have different approaches that are leading to 2 incredibly different outcomes. And the key difference, as I dug in, was actually how each approach deals with failure. You see, it turns out that failure is actually a really, really, really important part of learning. Now, before we go much further, I don't just want to keep throwing around the word failure and assume that we're all on the same page about what failure is. So, what is failure? I mean, I think for some of us, it's that sinking feeling in the pit of your stomach when you don't know the answer, and there's a person with an angry face kind of screaming at you, and a little bit of their spit's getting on your face, and everything's the worst, and you're just like, I just should not have gotten out of bed this morning. Like that's failure. And I can definitely relate to that as a definition of failure. Now, when I was prepping for this talk, I was like, well, I don't want to go off of what I think. Oh, that's failure right there. I don't want to go off of what I think failure is. I want to see what a bunch of other people think. So I sort of started looking at what lay people were saying, and they were like, failure is the absence of success. And I was like, oh, that's better than mine. I like that. That's good. But then I need to know what success is, and those same people were like, oh, that's easy. Success is the absence of failure. And I was like, oh, that's probably not going to work. But there are actually experts that study failure, and those experts have a definition. Failure to them is deviation from expected and desired results. And like I said, honestly, there's some truth in all of these for me, but that last one, that one is actually something that can be tested and measured. So for the rest of the talk, we're going to stick with that as the definition of failure. Now, I couldn't actually find any data on this, but as an occupation, I think software engineers are some of the people that deal with failure more than anyone else in the world. Like, you are just constantly failing until that one moment you get it right, and then you're like, yay, I guess I'll take the next ticket now. So you would think that programming would actually be the perfect place to learn from failure. But one of the only places that I could see where they fairly regularly capitalize on failure is video game development. And one of my favorite examples of this is with the game Space Invaders. Do you all know that game? So it's that old arcade game where you control a small cannon that's firing at a descending row of aliens. And as you defeat more aliens, they start speeding up, making it harder to shoot them, right? Yeah, nope, that is not what Space Invaders was supposed to be. The developer, Tomohiro Nishikado, had planned for the aliens to remain at a constant speed through the entire level, and only get faster when you got to the next screen. So if you think about all the games that were coming out back then, like Donkey Kong and Pac-Man, I don't know, old games, they didn't get harder as you went on the same level. It was always when the next screen started, that's when it got harder. And that's all he'd planned for. And that's what he wrote the code to do. But there was one tiny problem. He had designed the game for an ideal world. And I don't know if you know this, but 1978 was not ideal. And it turned out that he'd put too many characters on the screen, and the processors that they had at the time couldn't handle it. And so what happened is that when the game started up, the aliens would chug along really slowly, and as you got rid of the characters on the screen and the processors caught up, it would speed up to the speed that it was supposed to be. Now, Nishikado had a few ways he could have dealt with this failure. He obviously could have shelved the project until processors were faster. And it might seem silly, but maybe he was an artist and had a vision, and he's like, this is what the game is, and I'll wait until that's what it can be. He also could have modified the game. He could have said, okay, well, we want to hold it steady, so instead of 30 sprites on the screen, like 30 characters, we'll do 10. But instead, he had people test it out. He's like, well, we have a game, let's test it out and see what people think. And people really, really loved it. they got super excited as it sped up, and they started telling stories like, oh, the aliens are starting to get scared because they know I'm about to defeat them, and that's why they're running now, stupid aliens. And it was all, like, there was no story, but people started feeling that there was a story. And this game mechanic was so popular that they ended up keeping it in the game. Failure, in this case, was actually responsible for an entirely new game mechanic, the difficulty curve. So as I mentioned before, this games would stay at the same difficulty the entire level. Now, once this came out and it could speed up as the level went on, people started creating very different games. And games could get tougher at any point, and it was just, like, it was revolutionary, and it was a mistake. Now, I don't know if the developer had read the studies about failure, but he was capitalizing on a lesson that I see time and time again in the research. Failure is not something to hide from. It's something to learn from. And in fact, it turns out that failure actually presents a greater learning opportunity because there's more information encoded in failure than in success. So think about it. What does success usually look like? It's like a check mark, a thumbs up, a smile from your manager, hey, great job, pick up another ticket. And by the way, my manager is not like that at all. She's wonderful. So this is your manager, it's not. So what have you learned from any of those things? Well, there's actually research on this, and it shows that people in organizations that don't experience failure actually become rigid. Because the only feedback they get is telling them, just keep doing exactly what you're doing. Keep doing the same thing and everything will be all right. Don't change anything. And so that's what they keep doing. They don't try new things, they don't experiment. They just say, like, well, it worked last time, we'll keep doing it, we'll keep doing it. Now, failure, on the other hand, looks a whole lot more like this. Who's familiar with that kind of failure? Because I see it regularly. I mean, just look at this. There's so much information available in these 5 lines. So if you read it closely, you can figure out exactly what went wrong. You know which line in the code has an issue. And if you have experience with this particular error, you probably know what the issue most likely is. But even if you don't, if you've never seen it before, you're just a quick search away from pages worth of information from all of you that went home and wrote your technical blog posts about this particular failure. And now that you've had an experience with this approach that didn't work, you've actually learned something, and you know what not to do, and you've learned what to do. So it's just a bit of effort. Okay, something popped up on the screen, and I was like, is that on that screen? But it's not, so we're okay. So it's just a bit of effort. You can actually figure out how to write code that will work. And it was all from this failure that you had to go through. Now, video game development actually has a long honored history of grabbing hold of those mistakes and wrestling them into successes. And it is such an important concept, this exploitation of failures to make your program better, that it has a name. And that name is the good bad bug. Now, having space to learn from failures actually came in really handy for a group of developers that were working on a racing game in the 90s. So the concept that they had for the game was that players were going to race through city streets while being chased by police cars. And if the police caught you and pulled you over before you crossed the finish line, you lost. But there was one problem. They got the code for the algorithm wrong, and instead of law-abiding police cars that would pull the drag racers over, they got super aggressive cops that would just slam right into the racers as they drove by. And they handed this off to their beta testers, and their beta testers thought, oh, okay, no, okay, we're still good. The beta testers thought it was incredibly fun. Like, they just had so much fun trying to get away from these police, and they forgot that they were even racing. They didn't care about getting to the finish line. They were like, I just have to run away from these cops. And as a result, the entire direction of that game was changed, and the Grand Theft Auto series was born. So I want you to think about that. The core concept of the best-selling video game series of all time would have been lost if these developers had panicked and tried to cover up their mistake when they saw that they'd written the chase algorithm wrong. Now, with larger programs like video games, hundreds, if not thousands of hours of work might have already been done by product leads and designers and business folks before a developer ever gets to write their first line of code. And in game development, this is usually encapsulated in a document called the Game Design Document, or the GDD. And the GDD is supposed to be a living document. You're allowed to change it, but it changes late in the game, and I don't mean that as a pun, like, It's a big deal, because if you decide to make a change, you might have to change tech requirement pages, redo art pages, release dates might have to be pushed back, budgets might be off. I mean, like, it's a big deal to change it. But that was the unhappy reality that the Silent Hill developers were facing. You see, they started out by building the game to the exact specs that they were given, but there was a problem: pop-in. So the PlayStation's graphics card couldn't actually render all of the buildings and textures in the scene. So as you walked forward, buildings would suddenly pop into existence, and blank walls would magically have a texture that they didn't have before. Sorry. Oh, there we go, okay. Buttons, they're hard. Cool. So much like my randomly going through slides there, it distracted people from the game, seeing these things pop in. And horror games are actually super dependent on atmosphere that pulls players into the game. So it just wasn't gonna work. Now, it would have been easy for everyone to start pointing the finger at everyone else. After all, no one was fully responsible. They'd all played a tiny part, from designers who put 1 or 2 more buildings in the background to make it interesting, to the tech team that said, let's make it for the PlayStation instead of the more powerful 3DO or Jaguar, to the business team that determined what the release date would be. There wasn't a single individual that had made an obviously bad call. There were just a bunch of small issues that snowballed into a big problem. The whole system had failed. But instead of running from that failure, the Konami team, they sidestepped it. They found a workaround: fog. They filled the world with a dense, eerie fog. Now, it turns out that fog is actually pretty simple for a graphics card to render, because there's not much data. You're just like, oh, light stops. And it has a bonus of obscuring objects in the distance, which means you couldn't really see buildings and textures on the horizon popping in anymore. So you see, like, it's hidden, yay. And as an amazing added bonus, it was really, really super creepy. In fact, this dense fog was so creepy that long after processors were good enough that they didn't have to hide stuff anymore, it was still a staple of the Silent Hill game. Like, there is no Silent Hill without, like, soupy fog. So that's like another example of success being ripped from the jaws of defeat by embracing failure. Now, these examples from the programming world are helping to illustrate what was happening at our more high-stakes example in aviation and automobile accidents. You see, the aviation system saves so many more lives because accidents are treated like lessons that people can learn from. Data is gathered and aggregated, and patterns are identified. If an accident is caused by a pilot being tired, the investigators never just stop there. They look at pilot schedules and staff levels and flight readiness checklists to determine what contributed to the pilot being exhausted. Now, in contrast, who do we usually blame in a road accident? The driver, right? She was so reckless. He doesn't know how to drive. I mean, in other words, airplane accidents are treated as failures of a system, and road accidents are treated as failures of an individual. And with all that judgment being thrown around, it's no wonder people attempt to cover up their errors instead of acknowledging them and learning from them. I mean, how many times have you seen someone kind of roll through a stop sign, and if they get called on it, they're like, no, 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 I definitely stopped at that stop sign, and even if I didn't, it would be because a tree was blocking it, because I stop at every stop sign that I see. It's like you want to hide those things. Now, we're not all pilots here, but I think that there's a lot that we can learn from the way that they handle failure. If we're willing to use a system to track and learn from our failures as we write code, we are going to be so much better off. But what should that system look like? Because it probably is not going to look like this. I think in broad strokes that there are 3 things. And the first one is that you're going to need to avoid placing blame. You're going to need to collect a lot of data, and then you're going to have to abstract patterns from that data. So step 1, make sure that you understand that you are not the problem. And I think for a lot of us, that's easier said than done, right? I mean, when I'm learning something and I keep breaking it or failing, it's really hard for me not to beat myself up, especially if I look over and I'm like, oh, that person's learning it so much faster. This must not be my thing. I'm an idiot, right? I mean, that could be an entire talk on its own. But what I want you to remember is with aviation failures, they never stop at that top level of blame. So they never just say, oh, pilot's an idiot. So to illustrate, there was actually this one case where the pilot had made a critical error by dialing in the wrong destination in the flight computer. And on the cockpit recording, they could actually hear him yawn and talk about being excited to finally get a good night's sleep. Now, the investigators could have stopped there and blamed the pilot for being tired. But it wasn't enough to know that he was tired. They really wanted to know why. So they verified that he had actually had a hotel during his layover. And that wasn't enough. They verified that he had actually checked into that hotel that he had booked. And then they looked at records of every single time the door was opened so that they could establish the maximum amount of time that he could possibly have slept. And even then, they didn't just blame it on him having no more than 4 hours total to sleep. They looked at the 3-letter readout on the flight computer, and they saw that it could actually be pretty confusing if you're distracted or tired. Now, they're definitely willing to point out where individuals contribute to the failure. So this isn't one of those things where it's like, everyone, love everyone, no one's to blame, no one did anything wrong, just ignore that anything happened. But what they're focused on is what went wrong in the entire system. So it's not you as an individual are horrible and that's why it broke. It's, all right, let's look at how everything pieced together made this not work. Now, if you take away from failure in your code or anywhere else in your life that you're dumb or you can't learn this or it's just not your thing, you're missing out on all the best parts of failure. Now, you might not be at the point where you can quiet that voice in your head, and that's okay. For now, just try to ignore it and work the rest of the system. And given enough time, it'll probably start contributing helpful insights, or at least, shut up. So step 2 is to document everything. Now, this isn't just the big things. This is the tiny things. Like if you think back to that story at the beginning, I had a flat tire. A flat tire is no big deal. But they still wanted that documentation because they were like, well, what contributes to flat tires and how much wear and tear can they take, and are there instances where it could have been a big deal? So they document everything. And like you saw with the Silent Hill error, a lot of small errors and missteps can actually roll up to a major problem. So if you start to catch those problems early on and course correct, it's actually going to help you avoid those major meltdowns. So how do we document things? I'm actually a big fan of paper documentation because I like wasting paper and killing trees. But as long as you have some sort of record that you can refer back to, the form of the documentation is really up to you. You should definitely include details about what you were trying to do, what resources you were using, whether you were working with other people, how hungry or tired you were, and what the outcome was. You should get really specific when recording the outcome. So if you're trying to get data from your Rails backend out of your alt store into your React components, and it keeps telling you that you can't dispatch in the middle of a dispatch, you definitely shouldn't just write down, React is stupid and I can do all of this with jQuery, so why is my boss torturing me? Because that's not going to help. Trust me. Now, the final step is to actually start making use of all that data that you've been diligently gathering. Now imagine how powerful that data is as you go through it and you start extracting those patterns for when you do your best work and when you do your worst work. Instead of kind of vaguely remembering that you struggled the last few times that you tried to learn how to manipulate hashes in Ruby, you can see that you were actually only frustrated in 2 out of those 3 sessions. And the difference between the one where you felt good and the other 2 was that you were well rested for that one. Or maybe you noticed that you learn more when you pair, or when you have music playing, or when you've just eaten some amazing pineapple straight from Kona, Hawaii. That's when I do my best learning. On the flip side, you might also discover that you don't learn well past 9 p.m., or that you're more likely to be frustrated with something new if you haven't snuggled with a puppy for at least 20 minutes prior to opening your computer. And that's a really important thing to know. So it's a lot easier to identify the parts of the system that do and don't work when you actually have a paper trail, because relying on your memories aren't reliable. There's research on that too, trust me. Now you're also going to have a nice log of all the concepts that you're struggling with. So let's say your documentation from your last epic coding sesh, you look at it and you see, I was trying to wire up a form for my Rate This Raccoon app, and it worked, sort of. The data got where I was sending it, but the form data ended up in the URL instead, which was kind of weird. That's awesome. You now have a very well-defined problem to research. And it's not going to be too long at all after reading some form documentation that you realize that you were using the get action and that form and get forms that GET requests put data in the URL. And what you wanted was a POST request, because that keeps it hidden in the request body. Now all you're going to need after that is 20 minutes of puppy cuddle time, and you're going to be ready to go fix that form. Now, I've been focusing on how individuals can learn from failure, but it's also incredibly important for teams. So there was this famous study that looked at patient outcomes at demographically similar hospitals. And the strangest thing happened. They found that hospitals with nurse managers that focused on creating a learning-oriented culture instead of a blame-oriented culture actually had higher error rates. So if you had bosses that were like, you messed up and you're gone, your hospital had lower error rates. And that's not what the researchers were expecting at all. So they started digging in and they found out that while the error rates were higher, the patient outcomes were actually better. So more errors, but better patient outcomes. Which as a patient, I don't want errors, but I want better outcomes. So I'd be like, give me that other hospital. Now, what they did when they dug deeper was they found that nurses in the blame-oriented hospitals were terrified of getting punished, and they would start trying to cover up their errors. And this made it more likely that a patient would be harmed by a mistake, because they'd be spending their time trying to cover it up rather than fix it. But it also meant that the underlying issues wouldn't be addressed, and the same mistakes kept happening over and over again. So it wasn't that there were fewer mistakes happening, it was that mistakes were being covered up, and they were never dealt with. Now, it's the same story for our engineering teams. If you show me a dev team that has a zero tolerance policy for mistakes, I'll show you a dev team where the engineers spend a good portion of every working day covering up any mistakes that they make. If you focus on blameless post-mortems and reward experimentation, you're actually going to have a very different outcome. Now, like anything else you try, the process that I'm proposing probably won't work perfectly the first time around. And at the risk of going a bit too meta, just figure out what is and isn't working and see how you can adjust it. You can learn from failures while learning from failure. And then you're going to get more comfortable and you're going to start gleaning information from it, and you're going to find that every bug is actually a feature, as long as you can learn from it, even if you end up having to delete every single line of code and starting over. Now, traditionally, this was the end of my talk, but when I gave it early on, people would ask questions, and usually it was almost always a minority woman that would ask a variation of the same question, and she'd say, I've worked for years to be respected in my field. Do you think it's safe for me to fail publicly? And if I'm honest, I would say no. So I want to share a quick story about that. It'll tie back in. So I learned to read when I was 3, yay me, in the 80s in the US. That was enough to get you labeled as a gifted child. Now, I grew up regularly being told how intelligent I was, and it was reinforced so often that I was never embarrassed to ask questions, because it couldn't be that I didn't know it because I was dumb, because people constantly told me how smart I was. So it stuck with me through my coding boot camp. I was on the front row, constantly hand in the air, and it didn't change when I got my first programming job. If I didn't understand something, I'd ask for clarification. If it seemed like someone else was confused but was too embarrassed to ask, I just put my hand up in the air and asked for clarification, because I love to code and I love to learn, and it didn't bother me to be seen as like not knowing something. So I was like, oh, this is something I can do for other people. I can ask their questions. And a few years in, during a one-on-one, my manager said, oh yeah, you struggled to learn how to code. And that was weird to me, because except for a really tricky implementation of Backbone and Marionette, I didn't feel like I struggled more than anyone else. Code was one of those things that had made sense to me. But it turns out that all that time I spent asking questions when other people weren't made it seem like I was the only one that wasn't just getting it. Now, I didn't feel the need to correct him because, again, I have a gigantic ego when it comes to my intelligence. And I was like, well, if he wants to think that I struggle, that's fine. And when things were good, I got to work on a lot of interesting problems, and it wasn't a big deal. And then things got bad, and they had to do some layoffs. And I don't know if I would have been one of the devs that would have been kept. I was still pretty junior. But I do know that when you have to make a decision about who you're going to keep and who you're going to get rid of, if there's a developer on your team that you've labeled as struggling to learn how to code, you're like, oh, we're getting down to a skeleton crew, she's got to go. So this whole thing was pretty devastating to me. And I was like, that's it, I'm just not gonna ask questions anymore, I'm done. Like from now on, I'm gonna act like I'm an expert in everything. But there's another story I wanna share. So 4 years ago, I applied for a technical support job at GitHub. And I went through like 27 rounds of interviews. And I was positive I had the job because I was like, you do not drag someone in for 27 rounds of interview for technical support unless they've got the job. And I got an email that said, we think you're great. And I was like, yeah. But we've decided to hire someone with more experience with the product. And I was kind of bummed out because I loved everything I read about the company. And I was like, well, what do I do next? And I actually saw a tweet that's like, learn to code in 12 weeks. And I was like, that's not a real thing. But I did some research. And I was like, well, it can start you on a coding journey. And I did that instead. Learned how to code. And 4 years later, ended up as an engineer on the GitHub team. And I honestly believe that my path from not having enough experience to do technical support to being able to help build that product would have been a whole lot longer if I hadn't felt free to experiment and learn and fail. So you're gonna have to figure out what level of risk is acceptable to you and adjust accordingly. I'm super privileged. I had no debt, no dependents. There was another income in my household. So the only thing that suffered from being laid off was my ego. And that recovered, don't worry about that. On the other hand, I have people, like I have friends that are the first people in their family ever to not work a service job. They don't have extra income from their sweet dev jobs. They have money that can help pay their mother's rent, that can keep their grandmother getting the medicine that she needs. These are not people that can just be bummed out and then go find another job. The risk is so much higher for them. And if you don't know who these people are, one thing that's usually helpful for me is I look around a big room of developers and I'm like, well, who are the people that are less represented here? Because those are the people that are more likely to have more risk if they're seen as like struggling to learn. Indigenous people, any kind of ethnic minority, gender minorities, those people have more risk. And when they can't fail openly and experiment, it really sucks. It makes it harder for them to become great developers. But it can still work. So what I say to those people is project confidence at work, be like, oh yeah, I just whipped this up, even though what you're really saying is I spent 8 hours at home last night studying it. You're like, oh yeah, no, I'll write a blog post, I'm an expert, whatever. But find a safe place where you actually can fail openly and talk about what you're struggling with. Don't let other people's biases keep you from learning as much as you possibly can from those failures, because that's just such a, they're stealing so much when they don't let you fail. So find your people and then fail with them, but blog about how awesome you are so that other people don't see it. So I'm starting to ramble. I'm going to end there. Thank you so much for coming. If you haven't had enough of me talking code yet, you can check out my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/compchomp, which is the hardest thing to say, and I regret that name. I'd also love to continue the conversation on Twitter. I'm at @JessRudder. And if there's time, I'm happy to take questions, but if there's not time, no questions. Is there time? All right, we've got a thumbs up. We've got 5 minutes. If you have questions. If you don't, Nick will sing. No? Oh. Oh, I think did you have a question?
I walked away.
Now that I think all the entries are counted for the Culture Amp contest, I can say one of our values at Culture Amp is have the courage to be vulnerable. And I wonder if you have any advice to the leaders in the room. How can we make it safe for our team members to be vulnerable and not be judged for when they are?
Yeah, I mean, that's huge, is how can leaders make it safe for their team members to fail? I love telling stories about myself, so here's another one. When I worked in marketing, I was working in digital marketing, and I made a mistake that cost the company $30,000. It actually technically cost them more than that because it cost them the client, but there was an immediate bill of $30,000 that was going to fall on the company. I was making $50,000 at the time, so this was like a pretty huge, there was no way I could pay this back. I was also paying off student loans. So when I discovered the error that I had made, I was just in tears, and I was like, Dorab, I'm so sorry. He was the co-founder and CTO. I was like, I'm so sorry, I screwed this up. I'll figure out some way to pay you back. Like, I'm the worst. I'll pack up my desk and go. And he's like, you know, I've made mistakes that have cost us so much more than that. He's like, this is okay. And I'm like, you have not made mistakes. He goes, no, trust me. I've made mistakes that were way worse than this. And he just talked me through it. He's like, where do you think we went wrong? What do you think we could do better next time? He didn't even take me off the client because he was like, well, no one's going to be more careful with this client than you are moving forward. Which was true. The client didn't feel the same way, and I totally understand that. But yeah, so the best way, I think there are two things. One, talk about your own failures. So the fact that he was like, I too have failed. I mean, this guy had a PhD in computer science. He's the most brilliant, kind, generous person I know. And he's like, I've messed up royally. Let me tell you some stories. Being open about those failures makes other people feel comfortable being open also. And then not, punishing them and firing them when they mess up, but instead saying, cool, you messed up. Let's see what we do to make sure this doesn't happen in the future. Just modeling that, and eventually people will start to be more comfortable with it. But in the beginning, they're going to be in their office crying for like 20 minutes before they work up the courage to go get you. And, it happens. Any other questions? Back there.
Thank you for talking about this topic, because it's something close to my heart. As someone who's been a technical instructor teaching people to program, teaching adults to program, one of my biggest failures was dealing with people from different cultural backgrounds. And you talked a little bit about that, but I was wondering if there were any other advice that you could give. For example, people from certain cultural backgrounds, in my experience teaching, would just nod and smile and say, yes, I understand, even when they really didn't. They couldn't reproduce the work. And I couldn't crack that problem. I could not, in the duration I was an instructor, help those people. And I feel bad about it. And if that ever happens to me again, I'd like to do better. Do you have any comments on that?
I mean, the main thing that I would say is that there's a huge amount of research into teaching, and also specifically teaching people from particular cultures and what works best for them and the best way to approach it. And my ego's big, but it's not so big to stand up here and pretend I know anything about that. So yeah, I would say just the fact that you're aware of it helps, but then reaching out to experts and finding out what they think you should try and what they recommend, and then trying those things, and if they're not working, try something else. And an important thing that I think a lot of people forget is actually including members of those communities. There are going to be leaders in those communities that are out there that are in tech. We have amazing African American women that will tell you what is going to be most likely to help people like them get into tech. And it's not a one size fits all, but listening to them is a great start. So I would say experts and the people that are actually affected by those things are the places I would go for that. But it's great that you are at least aware, because I think a lot of times teachers are like, these students just don't get it. I guess they don't want to learn. I'm like, no one signed up for your program and showed up every day not wanting to learn. So yeah. Anyone? You've been lovely.